What's up, gangsters? How about episode 15 of the Spitfire adventure? And this is going to be another long episode, but I like this one better. This one has a lot more actually doing stuff than it does talking about doing stuff. So, anyway, hopefully that'll be better. Oh, and by the way, I just realized my shirt probably just says "Die First" if you're looking at it right there, just so you know. The other part of it says "Die first, then quit." These shirts are all the rage, so I decided to make one of my own. And this is actually the skull from one of my previous projects, the Stompy Robot project. It's painted on the hood of the junked out car. So anyway, that's that. Just didn't want anybody thinking I was telling you to die first. Literally. Really. Not really. Anyway, let's get on with this. Okay, time to move on to the next step, which is to start painting the dark earth. And as you can see, I am all masked up, and I'm really stoked with the way these masks turned out. I went back and printed another set with just a few small tweaks. I had some places where it just didn't extend far enough, and I really should have done a few more places like this right here, where it didn't quite cover the entire leading edge, because again, you're going from 2D to 3D. So I had to make up a few spots with some tape, but not a big deal. This one, where it passes over the canopy, I cut that into two pieces. Made a couple of little tweaks and slices, and had to trim a corner down here. But overall, I mean, yeah, I think you have to agree that this is all pretty good fit. And I'm ready to start doing some painting. So that's what's next. Okay, so I've been layering and marbling and blending, and this is a good point to kind of just check up and talk about where I'm at. And you know where I'm trying to get to, and a little bit about colors. All right, so look, this is where I want to be. I like this particular version of dark earth and RAF dark green. Now, this may not be exactly correct. You shouldn't assume that the people who make these color call-outs in the instructions are any better equipped than any of us are. They're under the same limitations, and they have the same challenge of color being perceptual that all the rest of us do. But I happen to like this particular combination. Is it exactly correct? Well, I don't know. This is MRP's version of Dark Earth. Let me get it shaken up. Okay, so this is what theirs looks like. Now, it's not bad, all right, but it's a little bit different than this. Okay, you can see the MRP version has a bit more blue in it than what's on this color plate. And it's honestly a little bit cool for my taste. So what I generally do is I don't get too obsessed with having the exact correct tone. As long as I'm within the right color neighborhood. Okay, I get pretty fanatical about interior green, for example. But as long as I know that I'm at something close to ANA 611 for a U.S. Army Air Force aircraft, if I go a bit to one side or the other of that, then not only is that fine, but it's actually desirable because it gives me some tonal variety and adds visual interest. And that's pretty realistic because, yes, these colors were specific colors. RAF dark green and RAF dark earth were specific colors, and this very well may be exactly correct. But, you know, as people like to say, there are variations with batches of paint and the people who were spraying the paint and the time of day and all those things. But you do have kind of a range that you need to be within. And within that range, I have no problem tweaking it to be a little bit more of what I like as opposed to what is necessarily absolutely correct or what the paint manufacturer thinks is correct. So what I try to do is establish a baseline for what I want my final color to look like with a mix, and that's what I've got right here. This is MRP RAF Dark Earth, toned to be a little bit more yellow with some of my favorite RLM 79. It's got about the same brightness value, so it works well for that. But I want it to be a little bit darker, and so I put in a little bit of this MRP Russian 6K. And I think I've got a pretty good approximation of what's on this color callout sheet. I like it. That's the bottom line. Now, having said that, I'm obviously not there with what's on the model. And that's to be expected for a couple of reasons. The number one reason is that MRP is just pretty translucent, and I had a pretty dark base under there with that Mr. Surfacer mahogany, and I would have had an even darker base. In fact, you can see the difference here where I had left this Aileron in black, Mr. Surfacer 1500. You can see that it is showing up a bit darker, which is fine. That's what I wanted. So I'm already starting from a darker place. But that's also what I want, because what I try to do as I work my way up through the layer stack with all of this, marbling and texturing, is to go from darker to lighter, so that when I get to a point where I'm happy with the contrast, that I have basically this color. And then any post shading I do will be one step lighter than this even. So that's kind of the process that I shoot for. Now, having said that, it's not exact. It's very much an on-the-fly kind of thing. It's very much iterative. And as you saw when I was working on the greens, there are times where I may have to back up and kind of adjust things. Because, it's kind of going to develop as you go, and you sort of have to be okay with that. So I feel like I'm at a pretty decent point here, though, because what I'm going to want to do is create some darker blotches along these areas of high traffic, like I did with the greens. So what I'm going to do now is use some of the sponge masking fluid technique for those areas. I'm going to lighten this base color yet a little bit more, because it is so translucent that in order to go a step lighter, I'm going to have to do that, and then shoot it, and we'll see how it looks. Okay, so back to this painting project, and as you can see, there's been some things going on. I went a little further than I intended to, and I'll explain why. So I feel pretty good about the overall tone. You can see, kind of the comparison between the Tamiya color callout and what I've got going on here. It took me a little bit to get to that tone, and in the process of getting there, you can see that I lost a lot of my tonal variety that I had been building in there. And some of this brown is pretty monochromatic, but it is what it is. Getting the overall tone was more important, because I can always come back and recover some of that tonal variety with some post shading, maybe, but more likely some oil paint rendering. And that's the thing to always remember with this, is that you're never really at the last step until you're really at the last step. And there are still a number of things that I can do to get where I want to be. So that's just how it goes sometimes. You just have to build your way up through the layers and the colors, and you have to pick the most important thing. Now, you can see I just peeled the masks off of all this, and one thing that you can see is I've got quite a little paint ridge there. I ended up building up more paint than I really expected to, but not a big deal. That's, again, one of the great things about working with these lacquers. just grab my 1000 grit Infinity sanding stick and some quick work across those, making sure that I don't get onto any details that are important, high spots sticking up. Obviously I did right there, but not a big deal because this whole area is going to be covered with a roundel, so not a big deal. If I do make a little bit of a mistake and uncover something like I did right there on that aileron, I'll either come back and repaint that. I might leave it, kind of looks kind of interesting, or I will catch it with some oils. So that's kind of where I'll leave this, that part of it anyway. I'll come back and do my, some detail sanding with this little power tool. And when we get back to the next segment, oh yeah, there's been some chipping going on. We'll talk about the chipping, maybe. Really, I did not intend to get into any of the chipping yet. The next thing was going to be painting all the insignia and the markings. Well, actually, I got to paint the bottom first, don't I? Can't forget about that. So that'll probably be next. But the reason that I went ahead and chipped this is because, I came to the sudden and horrible realization this morning. Like it was one of those things where I sat up in bed and was like, oh shit. And I realized that when I got ready to mask all of this green to spray the brown, that I wanted to make sure and clean off any skin oils, because I've been manhandling this thing like crazy, rubbing my nasty paws all over it. So I whipped out my little squirt bottle of 409, put a little bit on a rag, and wiped the whole thing down, put masking on it, and then proceeded to start spraying all this brown, forgetting that I had hairspray right here in these chipping areas, and that I very likely had wiped all the hairspray off with the 409. Just a dumb thing to do. And I had to figure out before I pulled off all this masking if I had in fact screwed up and was not going to be able to get any chipping, because then what I probably would have done, honestly, is I would have stripped this area, repainted it with silver, re-hairsprayed it, and then re-color coated it, which would not have been a horrible big deal if I had had to do that. But fortunately, I did not have to. And I think that this chipping looks pretty good. That's my first go-round at it. I'm rarely satisfied with the first try, but I feel pretty good about it. And hopefully it will go just as well on this side, and I will save that for a later video segment. All right, so back at it, and you will hopefully immediately notice that I've made a little bit of a change here. You can see that there's something funky going on with this right wingtip and aileron. And so what I've done here is I just wanted to introduce a little bit of visual interest by doing something that was pretty common. And that's telling a little story of parts that were replaced either with new parts or parts that came off of other aircraft. It was really a pretty common thing, and I think it's an easy way to add some visual interest and make your model more unique. And in this case, it was pretty simple. I'd actually already done it on this wingtip, but it just wasn't showing up quite as much, so I basically filtered it again with a mix of slightly darker green. The aileron, just masked it off, moved the mask over to show some differentiation there, and and this is not so much about getting colors that are exactly right, because you might look at that and go, well, those aren't correct colors. It's not really what matters. It's about getting something there that's different. And you can just assume that, maybe this was painted in the field or whatever, and it's not necessarily factory original colors, whatever. Again, it doesn't matter. It's not about getting it correct. It's about just setting up a little bit of visual interest. So it's time to move on, and the next thing that I want to do is paint the walkway strips. But here is the problem, and I've just kind of been stewing on this for a couple of days, and it's all about this area right here on the wing walk. I am not satisfied with it. Now, let me explain kind of how I got here, and then you'll understand why it looks the way it does. So my original plan was that I wanted to wait and do all of the painting and oil paint rendering before I did the chipping. And the reason is pretty simple. The problem with doing oil paint rendering after you do the chipping is that now you're trying to work around all of these tiny little chips if you want to introduce discoloration into the paint that represents staining or dirt or whatever, but that isn't necessarily going to carry over onto the raw aluminum. And this is not such a problem with armored vehicles because you're typically working on top of a rusted surface or another painted surface, and your colors really are not all that different, or they blend in. But with something like this, where you really want that chipping to stand out, it is an issue. And what can happen pretty quickly, I've found, especially when you're dealing with really, really tiny little chips that I've gotten both through just doing the chipping through the normal process and through doing some sanding, is that it can become muddy pretty quickly. And by muddy, what I mean is that you just kind of have this sort of mess, like I kind of have going on here. And it's really important, if you want the weathered effects to read correctly, that you maintain separation. If you spend some time looking at the work of guys like Mike Rinaldi, you can look at one of his models and you can clearly pick out each of the effects that he's used. And that's because he's got such good control and he maintains such good separation, both through good technique and good color choices. So what I was hoping to do here was eliminate that problem of having to do the OPR after I did the chipping, because I knew that I was going to want to make this look a little bit dirty, because dirt gets ground into paint when you're walking on it, it gets stained, and that's a thing. And I was hoping to try and avoid that issue initially by doing the oil and then doing the chipping. Okay, so I wasn't totally confident that was going to work out though, so I kind of did a belt and suspenders approach, and I put a bunch of darker tones down before I put the final tones on that RAF dark earth. Because what I figured I would do, and it is in fact what I have done, is that as I sanded through some of it, I would expose some of the darker stuff underneath, and that would get me that discoloration without screwing up the chips, because the chips would just still be there as normal. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyhow, so I did that, but I think that I kind of overcooked it, because several people have registered some disgust at how dark and nasty that all looks right there in that dark earth paint. And I was already kind of there. I was not totally happy with it myself. It doesn't look unrealistic, but the thing is, realistic does not necessarily mean that it looks good. There's an intersection between realism and aesthetically pleasing, and finding that intersection is the key to something that looks really cool. And right now, I just don't think this looks really cool. I think that the chipping is fine. Somebody made a comment that if it was a different way that it would be more accurate, and they posted a picture of a Spitfire wing root wear. Look, I've got over 500 Spitfire images, and several dozen of which show wing root paint wear, and none of them are the same. So the idea that it's going to only be accurate if it's done a certain way is kind of silly, but nonetheless, this still just doesn't really look all that great. It's not terrible, but it's just not good enough to satisfy what I want. I don't like all of the muddiness that's going on over here, and so I'm going to redo this area. I don't really want to, but it's really not that hard. And the truth is that in this entire Spitfire series, I haven't really had an episode where I had to, unfuck something. And so it'll be kind of good. You guys will get a chance to see what happens when I don't like it and I decide to redo it. So I'm going to get on with that. And the first thing that I'm going to do is tape this area off, because I'm only going to focus on this one section right here. Okay, so the first step is to tape this off, and I've burnished that down really well because I don't want anything bleeding underneath. If it does, it's not the end of the world, but I like what's going on outside of that tape, and I don't really want to do any more work than necessary. So the first thing I'm going to do is try and just remove that paint. And I'm going to start with the mildest solvent possible. I mean, I guess that would be water, so not that, but I've got a little bit of isopropyl alcohol in here because we know that MRP comes off very quickly with IPA. So again, trying to be very careful and not get into places that I don't want to be. I'm just going to focus on scrubbing that off. And you can see how quickly I am down to just the bare plastic. I went right through everything in a heartbeat. And I'm not going to worry with trying to only remove up the upper layers and preserve the aluminum. I'm just gonna get right in there and get all of it off, and come back and respray it, re-chip it. Well, I'm not going to chip it yet. I'm going to stick to my guns that I was originally going to do of not doing the chipping until it's time to do the chipping. So I will just respray it with some primer and some aluminum and some hairspray and some color coat, and then we'll come back and see how it looks. All right, this is all nicely cleaned off, and got some Post-it notes to make sure I don't have any overspray, and I'm gonna just shoot a light coat of Mr. Surfacer 1500 on there. Not gonna worry about the mahogany because this is all gonna get covered over with MRP Super Silver. So, just going to keep it simple. Okay, so it's like an hour later, and I shot the aluminum on there, shot some hairspray after letting the aluminum dry for, I don't know, it was almost an hour. Anyway, then went ahead and sprayed some of my dark earth mixes that I had saved, and this is exactly why I save paint. And what I do is I just put these little lids on top of my mixing cups, and that has never failed me. Anyway, so what I did is I just did a little bit of post shading. I got the color as close to the rest of it as I could, and Then did a little bit of post shading and blending with a little bit of a darker mix. And I feel like that gives me the sort of darkened and discolored paint at a sort of a subtle level that I want in that area. And so now when I go back and chip that, I feel like that kind of takes care of all of those issues that I was bringing up before. I don't know, I'll think about it. I may do a little bit of oil work on there before I chip it, but I don't know. Plenty of time to decide on that. None of that has to happen for a while yet, because the next thing I am going to do is spray those do not walk lines. Okay, time to move on with some wing walk stripes. And I choose to paint these things for a couple of reasons, but if you want to use the decals, obviously, they are right here on the decal sheet. One of the reasons, however, that I don't like using them is because if you look, you can see that there is film on the outside their edge, on the outside their edge, on the outside edge there that's going to show. What about the Walkway forward decal? Well, worry about that down the road. I've got something coming in the mail to address that. So, how to paint these things? It's really just masking, and what I've done is I've used some of my 0.4 millimeter Izu tape to create a strip of the correct width. So you can see on one side I've put it on I put the strip of tape down and use that as a guide to place the two masking strips of my favorite washi tape, and then removed the guide piece, and I still have the guide pieces over here so you can see that. So I'll just take those off and paint that here in a second. Now, again, why do I want to paint these? Well, another reason, and probably my best reason, is because I'll be able to do a little bit of weathering on these stripes after I paint them, the way that I would weather any other kind of paint. And it's possible to do that with decals. It's just a little bit more difficult. Now, what about the time that it took? Okay, it took me about, I don't know, probably 45 minutes to do this masking, and it'll take me just a second to spray them. And you might say, well, wow, that's a lot longer than doing the decals. Well, maybe, but it depends on how you approach it. If you're just going to, yank these off the sheet, slap them down there, and move on, then yeah, that's going to take you, 10 or 15 minutes, maybe, assuming you don't have any problems. But, if you don't like that film, if you want to bury the film under a coat of clear and do some sanding, that is definitely going to occupy 45 minutes worth. So I feel like that in terms of time, if you want really good results, then this method is actually faster. All right, so let's do some painting real quick. As you can see, I've already sprayed these on the left wing. So let's go ahead and do the ones over here. Now, I think a lot of guys are afraid to do stuff like this because they're worried that they're going to get leakages under their tape, or they're going to get overspray or whatever. So it is important to have your tape burnished down on the painting edge. Definitely want to do that. But as far as leakages or overspray, that's just all about airbrush control. And you can see that I'm spraying really close. And that's the best way to control overspray. Basically, if you want to put it in mathematical terms, as long as my airbrush is closer to the workpiece than the length of the shortest segment of masking material, I can't get overspray, right? There's just no physical way for a paint particle to fly outside of that orange box if I'm closer to the workpiece than the width of that piece of tape. and as long as I keep my airbrush pointed straight at the work, which you should always be trying to do anyway. I mean, obviously there are exceptions, but the general rule of thumb is that you want your paint coming from a 90-degree angle to the work surface. So if you're doing that, then you should be in good shape. It's also important to spray pretty dry. I'm taking care to spray a little drier than I normally would. If you can see the paint, and it's hard, I know, with the airbrush being in the way, but if you can see the paint, you'll notice that it's basically, I'm not spraying wet at all, maybe just slightly, and I'm moving pretty fast. And if the paint does go down wet at all, it's flashing immediately. And I'm only going to do 2 layers because that's really all that's needed to give me the coverage that's required for a black stripe like that. So basically, I'm just not giving the paint any opportunity to leak underneath that tape. So let's take a look. All right. Let's see how we did, and if my theory and ballyhoo about how to avoid problems actually worked. So let's see, and this is another great thing about working with these lacquers. They go down so thin and they flash so quickly that you really shouldn't have any issues with any kind of leakage or anything like that, and obviously I'm able to take the tape off right away. Now, one thing that I always try to reiterate when you're peeling your masking tape, okay, don't pull it straight up from the surface, because that's when you're putting the most force on the paint that tape is stuck to, and that's when you're most likely to yank a chunk of paint out that you're then going to have to go back and fix. It's always, as a rule, best to pull your tape back on itself, just like that. See, rather than straight up, I'm pulling it back on itself and at an angle away from the paint line. So I'm not pulling it this way, I'm pulling it this way. And so you create more of a shearing force than a pulling force. And this is just an old painter's rule for removing masking tape. I know it sounds kind of silly, but yes, there is in fact a correct way to remove your tape. Now, speaking of masking, I wanted to mention before I forgot, you don't have to necessarily use this Aizu tape if you don't have it or don't want to buy it. And in fact, it's a little wide for these. It's probably 0.1 or 0.2 millimeters too wide, but I think it's going to be fine. You can also, there's a bunch of different ways to cut strips of tape, but this Infini Type A cutting board is fantastic for this sort of thing. You can see how it works. It's got grooves. Those are actually etched into the board. And so you put your tape on there, and the grooves guide your knife blade so that you can cut nice thin strips like that. And ideally, even though my Aizu tape is supposed to be 0.4 millimeters wide, I think it is actually a little wider, and I probably should have cut myself some strips off of here. But it's all good. I think they're fine. So there's the stripes, and now it's going to be time to move on to spraying the belly of the beast. Actually, before I get to painting the bottom, let's get into my favorite reason for painting these wing walk stripes. Okay, 1000 grit Infini sanding sponge, one of my absolute favorite things, and I'm going to just cut a piece off here. With this little piece cut off, I've now got my little sanding power tool, which I love. All right, so now let's zoom in. And the first thing I do, and I've already done that, is I just take the larger sponge, 1000 grit, and I just take a few quick swipes across the whole thing where the area permits, and there's nothing, no details in the way that I have to worry about. Sorry about the crazy camera work. Anyway, then what I'm going to do is just go and start working on areas that are naturally going to be worn down. And I know that these are supposed to be stripes that keep people from walking in certain areas, but all you have to do is look at a bunch of Spitfire reference photos and you'll see pretty quickly that these were treated more as a suggestion rather than an actual rule, and that there was plenty of walking on the don't walk areas. So I'm going to just very carefully sand through that, and you can see that right there I'm wearing through a little bit to the aluminum paint that's underneath there, and that's exactly what I want. I want a little bit of scuffing and wear to show, just very lightly. So that's good. I like that. The right-hand wing was not used as much as the left wing. That's not a political statement, don't freak out, but it certainly was used. So, all right, now, and here next to the gun covers, going to be some wear right there, I think. That's reasonable. So, there we go. Plus, it's paint, it fades, and so if you want to do even more, you can, but the thing is that this is just another little device that is available to tell the story. The story that says, hey, these things were getting a lot of use and there were people at work. So there we go. And and again, I rarely am satisfied with my first go at something like this. So this is just kind of a quick pass, but this is the basic process. And this one especially gets beat on in this area because that is the primary walkway. And yes, I am going to have to weather the walkway inboard and outboard stencils to match, and we'll get to that when those things come along. All right, what the hell? I can't resist going ahead and doing some chipping here. You can see the siren song of the tiny little flecks of paint has gotten to me, and I know that you guys want to see this anyway, and hey, no better time than the present. So let's zoom in here and let's do some paint destruction. My absolute favorite thing to do. Now, you may not be able to tell, but what I have done already is I used my little sanding foot to do a little bit of abrasion in that area already. Come on now, let's focus up there. Okay, and hopefully you can see it's pretty subtle, but I worked this area here and a little bit up here by this round thing. And that's for two reasons. One is I want to create some abrasion, because abrasion is a different phenomenon than chipping itself. Chipping very well may start with abrasion, as it probably does in this case, not always. But abrasion is a different mechanism, and chipping is if you want to call it that, it's kind of the basic, the simplest paint wear mechanism. Abrasion is a little bit more complex and it's more difficult to create. And sanding is, I believe, the best way to do it because it mimics the real process, right? And you can get a lot of control and you can get a lot of really, really tiny and subtle effects by using that principle. So, and I apologize. I know that the camera work here is going to be horrible, but it kind of is what it is in this situation. So I'm going to just do a little bit more sanding here. And the second reason that I'm doing the sanding is because I want to open that paint up a little bit and give the water that I'm going to use an easier path in there, because that's the basic mechanism, is that the water goes through the color coat and activates that hairspray, and that's what causes paint to fall off. So now I've got this little tiny brush and I've got a little bit of water on it, and always start with the least amount of water and the least aggressive tool. That way you can figure out before you screw up exactly how much it's going to take. And I just took most of the water off of that brush, so it's got just a little bit on there. And you can see that I'm kind of doing this tapping motion because what I'm trying to do is stab little holes in the paint that will allow chips to begin to form. And as soon as I see that happening, and it's happening pretty quick here because the paint is so thin right now. So as soon as you see that happening, you have to back off, because this is where we get into the rule. There is no such thing as a chip that's too small. So what I'm trying to do is create a sort of a triangular shaped pattern that's pretty characteristic of spits because of the way people get up on there. Just gradually introduce some chaos into that pattern. All right, so I'm pretty good with what's going on here. Now I want to start working my way forward along the wing. So again, just using the minimum amount of water, and if nothing happens, then you can use more water, and if still nothing happens, then you can move to a more aggressive tool. And with lacquers, you may find yourself having to get a bit barbaric because they are, they're tougher, and especially when they have the sheen that MRP naturally does, that semi-gloss or glossy surface makes it more difficult for the water to get under there. Okay, so I've just been pecking away at that, and that is kind of my primary mode with doing chipping on lacquers, is that pecking motion. When you watch these videos on YouTube where guys are doing chipping, you'll see just, they're just kind of doing this brushing thing, and the paint is just magically flying off of there. It's important to remember what kind of paint they're chipping. If they're doing chipping on normal acrylics like the Vallejos, the AKs, the MIGs, that stuff comes flying off of there pretty easy. Even tamiya, even when you use lacquer thinner with tamiya, and it's tougher than it is if you've used X20A or something like that, still, it comes off a lot easier than lacquers do. So just keep that in mind when you're chipping with lacquers. And I've actually got a whole video specifically about doing hairspray chipping with MRP. The technique is just a little bit different. And so if if I had chipping fluid over here where the paint is still fully dense and kind of shiny, and I could put a gallon of water on that and sit there rubbing back and forth on it like this all day long, and it's never going to do anything. And this is what happens. It frustrates a lot of guys when they're trying to chip with MRP. They're like, nothing's happening. I don't understand. Well, that's because you just have to take a slightly different approach to it. And I will even sometimes use one of these little fiberglass brushes, like this right here. There's two different styles of fiberglass brush. This is the softer style that does not eat plastic, but it's great for wearing on paint, and especially with chipping, because when you do that tapping motion, it's relatively stiff, and those little tiny bristles will stab little bitty holes in the paint and let that water through. But it's too big and too aggressive for this situation. If I had not been able to get any action, using this, however, I wouldn't have hesitated to graduate to that fiberglass brush. So I'm going to just kind of let that sit there for a while. One thing that I find is really important with chipping is do some, and when you think you're good, then just pull yourself away, step back, and then just look at it for a day or two and see how it looks and see how it feels. I have almost never come away from even a little bitty chipping exercise like this in less than 2 or 3 passes at it, because it looks great, it's fun, and it's awesome, and you're enthusiastic when you first do it. But then if you start to examine it, as a couple of days go by, you will find probably areas that can stand to be tuned up. So anyway, with that, I'm going to go ahead and tackle this side now, and we'll come back and take a look at it here in a minute. All right, so as you guys can see, I have been busy painting the bottom, and I'll talk more about that directly, but I want to show you something, because I'm working on the individual pieces that obviously go on the bottom, that all have to be the same colors. And I know it may not make much sense, but even though I'm doing the black and white scheme on the bottom, I elected to go ahead and paint the outside of the gear covers with sky, and that's because I'm going to do some chipping. Anyhow, what I want to show you is take a look at this. Hopefully this will show up on camera. It's pretty subtle, so bear with me while I try to get the correct angle. Okay, maybe you can see that there. See that what looks like kind of a gritty texture there on that part, and how it's not uniform across the whole thing. You can see it a little bit better on this one. There's a pretty good view right there. Now if I could really zoom in there, you would see that those areas that look gritty are actually wrinkled. It should look nice and smooth like that part right there, with that natural sort of eggshell sheen that MRP has. So what happened? Why did that, what went wrong there? You'll see guys ask about this on internet groups a lot. Well, nothing really went wrong. These were sprayed normal, just like everything else. I sprayed all the parts on this sprue at the same time, and these have that issue and these don't. So why? So what happens here is that sometimes you'll see this where parts will have differing properties, at least on their surface, because of mold flow effects when the plastic is injected into the mold. And that that could be because of the way that it cools, whatever. Bottom line is that you have slightly different material properties right there, and the thinners, lacquer thinners, the compounds that are in lacquer thinners being pretty hot, are hot enough to cause a crazing reaction in just those areas. So it's not anything you did wrong. You just got caught up in, sort of a physical phenomenon. And it's not really a big deal. Just give it a little bit of sanding, repaint it, and move on. Here you go. I just did sand that, and now you can really see the effect where there's still some little, low spots and high spots there, and you can see the difference in the two colors of paint. You can see where it's smoother versus where it still has a little bit of that texture. Okay, so I have been happily painting and then destroying paint. That's when I'm in my happy place. And I also promised to explain this black and white color scheme. So let me just get to that right off the bat. So the deal with that, as I now understand it, is that the original black and white color scheme was like this. Okay, like they've got it here in the instructions, where the wings were black and white, and the remainder of the belly was RAF high-speed silver or maybe bare aluminum. Okay, that was the earliest version of it, apparently, because the earliest earlier Spitfires had that silver on the belly, like you can see over here, where they had the entire thing. Then they introduced this, and then there's also the version of it where the black and white covers the entire wing and fuselage area. But then that went away. My understanding is by like the beginning of 1940, early like spring 1940. But then in late November of 1940, they reintroduced it. And it was just supposed to be the port wing being night. And night is actually not black. It's actually an extremely dark blue, but black is close enough. So it really was not supposed to have this wing being white. By then they had gone to the entire undersurface being Sky Type S. But I have a picture of one that very clearly shows that you've got all three colors on the belly of the aircraft. So the bottom line is that this certainly could have happened, and the more I read about it, the more they confirm that. The more the things that I read confirm that as much as Spitfire stuff in general was all over the map, underside colors early in the war were even more all over the map. And it was, kind of catch as catch can, and a lot of these things were done at the unit level in the field. Obviously, they were pretty busy with the Battle of Britain and all that. So I feel pretty good about this. I think it's probably completely plausible. And I think that it's interesting, certainly more interesting than just doing the whole thing in Sky Type S. So, as you can see, I've also been doing some wear and tear. And you can see that I've got these pieces that go in the middle, dry fitted in there, and that I've done some wear on those as if they would have been maybe more frequently removed for maintenance. Same thing with the chin piece there. You can see that I've worn the paint around, and that's just by doing very, very light and careful targeted sanding. Just enough to expose those Zeus fasteners so that they stand out and kind of tell the story of, having been operated on. Same thing around these lower access panels. I have no idea how often they actually got in these underneath the wing, but it doesn't really matter because it tells the story, looks plausible. And I really like the way that slightly green sky paint contrasts with the black. And same thing over here on the white. Now, what's going on with that aileron? Well, I decided to make this as a replacement aileron. And I may have talked about this in the previous segment. I'm not sure, don't remember. but you can see it right here. And yeah, I think I did talk about it with, these colors not necessarily being exact, but just enough to, again, tell the story and illustrate that something is different there. So I like that. Again, just something else to make it a little bit more unique and interesting. I also purposely did a less than perfect job of spraying the black and the white inside the wheel wells, because pretty easy to believe that that's, kind of how it would have happened. Not something that they particularly needed to take a lot of time and care with, especially since this paint job only lasted until probably early 1941. So what I'm depicting here is an aircraft as it might have been in, say, the spring or early summer of 1941. So with all that, I also wanted to show a little bit of wear on the gear covers. So I chipped the paint off of those to reveal some of that sky underneath. And the way that I did this chipping is something that I'm doing more and more. I did the sanding first, and just light targeted sanding with these real fine pieces of Infini sanding sponge, and then did the chipping. But one thing that I did differently on this stuff right here, on the wings, is something that a dude named Warwick Gresswell, he's one of our SMCG guys and a really, really talented modeler and painter from Australia. He's been doing some stuff with his Gundam work where he actually does the chipping with a piece of wet sanding sponge. And I decided to try that, and it works pretty good. Basically, all I did was just dip the sanding sponge in this little bit of water, and then just kind of wart it around on that surface. Not actually like really doing a lot of straight sanding. There's a little goober right there I need to get. Not actually doing a lot of straight sanding like I'm doing right here, but just kind of warting it around and scrubbing it in different directions and around in circles, and trying to focus on areas that would have had hands and tools beaten on them a little bit. And I like it. It works pretty good, and it gave me, as you can see, some really, really nice tiny chips in that area. Now, all of this scuffing from the sanding will go away when I shoot some dull coat on that down the road, so no worries there. So these pieces are all ready for assembly on the bottom, and when I get ready to, which will be after I paint all the markings and the insignia, I will be able to just put the landing gear in there and assemble all of it pretty easily. So, and the way that these tamiya parts fit makes that a pretty predictable process. Okay, the top side is basically all done with its basic paint work. I'm pretty happy with the chipping and the scuffing that I've achieved here on top. I am totally happy with my decision to redo this chipping over here on the left. I think it looks much better now, and I'm happy that I put the work in to redo that. I like it. But having said that, and I still had enough chipping hairspray apparently right there to get a little bit around the leading edge of that cockpit door. Anyway, having said all that, I am pretty happy with the way things look right now. But what I'm going to do now is just let the thing sit and talk to me for a few days, because I've got some other things going on, and the next phase is going to be to spray all of the insignia and markings, and I haven't created the masks for those yet, so got a little bit of work to do before moving on. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully that will be useful stuff for this project or for any others. Hopefully what you can see, though, is a point that I was trying to make somewhere along the way there, that the idea of waiting until you're done painting to start weathering, you can see why I don't really believe in that philosophy, because obviously I'm starting the weathering before I start painting and doing a lot of weathering while I'm doing the painting. And this kind of gets to something that I seem to see quite a bit lately, and that's the idea that chipping is somehow different than weathering. And again, that's just something that I kind of feel like is ridiculous. As far as I'm concerned, anything that happens to the paint is weathering. Doesn't matter if it's paint getting knocked off, or getting sunshined on it, or dirt deposited on it, or mud splattered on it, or oil spilled on it, or whatever. To me, it's all weathering. And for me, that's the most fun part. Anyway, I'll stop running my mouth and sign off. Like I said, hopefully this will be useful. And as always, I appreciate you guys watching. Much love.